So what is CLS? Well, CLS is chemistry of life. And it's one of the first units of the AP Bio kind of curriculum, and it really is based on water. So what's going to happen is water and all the chemical reactions that water is involved with and the properties of water is kind of going to determine the properties of proteins, lipids, and nucleotides. And those three things are key into how everything interacts with each other, from in the cell to metabolism to even structures that protect us like the skin and stuff. So that's kind of what I want to go over right here, is the chemistry of life. We're going to focus on the first part right now. You'll notice that in the first unit, in the AP Bio, they kind of break it up in three parts. They have properties of water, macromolecules, DNA, RNA. And today we're going to focus on water, and then eventually lead on to proteins, lipids, and then nucleotides. So that's kind of what we have installed. So what is the main structures? And here they are. And I have pictures of each one. You have proteins, which is a big structure in our bodies. And we're going to talk about the amino acid parts. And then we're going to do secondary structure as it folds up, tertiary structure as it folds up more, quaternary structures when they fold up and kind of add on to each other. So we're going to see all these different things. We're going to see where it's located in our bodies, how they function, how they get to where certain places are, and what happens when we break them apart. What happens if they're not functioning correctly. So we're going to explore that pretty much for the first, I say, a good couple of weeks. We're going to stick with protein structures, folding, enzymes. It's really, really big. Then we're going to do lipids, which is kind of hydrocarbons. And we're going to talk about the structure of that, the nomenclature, and the functional groups that could be attached to it, and it'll give it different properties. And the last part is DNA or nucleotides and how that information is stored. And what's amazing is that water is incorporated in all three of these structures. The properties of water, or just the dynamics between oxygen and hydrogen. So that relationship in itself is going to determine how these shapes and forms and how they interact with each other. So we're really going to focus on water right now. So water has a couple of properties. It's polar, which we're going to explain about. And because it's polar, it's going to have all these other qualities. Because of this, it's going to have cohesion and adhesion. It's going to have a certain property between solids and liquids. It's going to have high specific heat. And because of that, it's also going to have a high heat of vaporization or fusion. So it's going to take a lot of energy to break it apart. It likes to attach to things that are polar. And because of that, it really gives us the key element to sustaining life. And the main thing that makes this possible is something called electronegativity. So water is made of, H2O. And it's based like this. You have one big oxygen, you have a covalent bond with hydrogens, and then you have two lone pairs over here, and then technically two pairs of electrons over here. So let me actually change the color so it will stand out more. So we have electrons here and electrons here, and it's being shared. Now when we look at it, hydrogen's over here and oxygen is over here. And you'll notice that electronegativity goes from low all the way to high. Why? Remember, these are noble gases. That means they're happy. They have a full octet, or at least they feel like a full octet. Helium technically only has two, but the rest of them have a full outer shell. So they're really, really happy. The goal of every, well, we could focus, the goal of these and these, transitional metals is a little bit different, but at least the goals of these is to get there. So here it's easier to lose. Here is easier to gain. So when it's possible, hydrogen wants to get rid of its electron, and in this case, oxygen wants to gain. So this one wants to gain, and they want to lose. So when they're in a covalent bond, when they're sharing electrons with each other, what's going to happen is that these electrons are going to get pulled over to the oxygen. So that's what electronegativity is, how much they want the electron. And then the relationship between here, oxygen is going to want a lot more. So what's going to happen is when we look at the relationship, here's the structure of water. This is kind of the structure that you have in your chemistry where they're perfectly shared, perfectly distributed between the two, but in reality it's not. Reality, remember, it's an electron cloud. Electrons technically aren't here, they're just somewhere in this vicinity. So when you look at this structure, what I like about it more, it kind of shows you where these electrons are and what's going to happen. You have a bigger density of electrons on this side compared to the other side. So here you have a lot more negatives. So here you have something called a partial negative, and here you're going to have partial positives. And that's kind of what gives water its properties. It has a polar, two sides, one positive, one negative, and because of that, it's going to have properties with other polar objects. So with itself, it's going to have certain properties. And with something that's polar, it's going to have certain properties. So you'll notice with itself, it's going to create something called hydrogen bonds. The hydrogen here is going to react with another oxygen because this is negative. This one's positive. It's going to create something called a hydrogen bond. Here's another one, positive with negative. Okay, positive and negative. And it's going to create these connections or chains with each other, which kind of adheres with each other. The same thing can happen if you have a relationship with something that's an ion. So here you have salt, which is an ionic bond. When you put it in water, it actually dissolves fairly easily. And that's because you have partial positive, partial negatives. And what's going to happen is it's going to suck the negative ion and it's going to surround it with hydrogens-ish. And then with a positive one, it's going to surround it with oxygen. And that's why things like salts are very, very easily dissolvable in water because of this. Anything else that's polar is going to dissolve in this. So sugar molecules are polar, so they have a very easy time of dissolving in water. Now, fats aren't polar. They have absolutely no oxygen and hydrogens, at least most of the ones that we're going to see. They're just carbons and hydrogens, and they actually share those electrons fairly evenly. So when we go back to the slide with electronegativity, if it was fats, carbon, it's kind of in the middle. So it's going to be the same as hydrogen. So it's not going to want or lose. It's kind of just there. So when it's carbon, carbon's a little bit more electronegative than the hydrogen, but not as much. So it's going to be kind of non-polar. Now, how does this property of being polar affect all the other properties of water? Well, because of this, it's going to have a high specific heat. So let's say this is your typical solid. There's no interaction between the two. So if you enter energy, it's very easy to make this thing vibrate because it doesn't have any relationship with each other. It's not attached to its neighbor. As you increase even more energy, it's easier for this molecule to move. Increase energy, easier to move, and it's actually easier to escape as a gas because it's not connected. Now, if this was water, though, there's going to be tiny little bonds in between these molecules. So as you're increasing energy, as an ice, as a water, or even as gas, it's going to be harder to increase the temperature. So for water, it actually has one of the highest specific heats. So amount of energy, remember, I forgot to say it, specific heat is the amount of energy required to raise it 1 degree. So for water, it requires a lot compared to other objects or other chemicals or molecules out there because of this hydrogen bond. And also because of that, you're going to have a lot of energy required for it to change from solid to liquid and liquid to gas because of that hydrogen bond. It's very important. Here's a picture of the same thing, but kind of showing you the differences. So in solid, you have a lot of hydrogen bonds keeping it together, so it takes a lot of energy to break it apart. Here it's going to have hydrogen bonds here, take energy to break it apart, etc. Also, another thing that you see because of hydrogen bonds, when it's in a solid configuration, it forms this crystal that actually takes up more space. So that's another cool thing about water, is that this solid is going to be less dense than liquid, and liquid's going to be more dense than gas. So it's actually a really cool thing where ice is going to float, which also helps with insulation. So all these are properties of water that make it very, very sustainable and helping life along. Okay. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Properties of water, and it really is based on hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds give it all these things. Because of its polar molecule, it's going to create hydrogen bonds. Oh, that was horrible. It's going to create hydrogen bonds. And these hydrogen bonds are going to help with cohesion, help with density, help with high specific heat, and heat evaporation. And then we're going to focus on this relationship between oxygen and hydrogen is going to be very important because it's going to determine a lot of our chemicals. So remember, this is going to be pulled that way. A lot of our structures and lipids and proteins and even reactions get based on this difference in electronegativity between oxygen and hydrogen, and a lot of our chemical reactions are going to be based on that. So the first thing we're going to go into is proteins.